Okay, so LatinNow is short for the Latinization of the Northwestern Roman provinces. It's funded by the European Research Council and it's hosted at the University of Nottingham with formal partnerships with the Centre for the Study of Ancient Documents at Oxford, with the University of Leicester and with a unit of the CNRS in Lyon. And we started in 2017. It's far from over yet. We've got until 2023 to do our final conclusions. It's a big team, and our core team is composed of some wonderful postdocs, technical director Scott Vanderbilt, who's on the call today, I think, and senior scientists. But we depend on collaboration from across Europe. So we work with museum staff and staff in a range of different institutions across Europe. And I want to say here just how grateful we are to all of those who've shared their data with us over the years. We are so grateful for that. And you'll see as we go through these slides just how essential this data is for doing what we need to do. And I also should say that digital humanities are a really important part of the LatinNow project, but we rarely get asked to talk just about the digital humanities part of it. So I'm really excited today to focus in on the DH side of things. I should also say that this was billed as a DH more generally rather than a classics talk. So some of the classicists out there, please don't be put off. We're trying to talk to not just the classicists. So if we explain what epigraphy is, you'll just have to be patient. So let's start at the beginning. So let's tell you what we're going to be doing today, hopefully. So it's not so much a workshop, sadly, because we're not in person, as much as a presentation. I'm going to start off by introducing the LatinNow project, focusing on our research questions, concepts, and methodology. Then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the case study of Rome and Britain. I'm going to tell you how we're using digital techniques to read inscribed objects using reflectance transformation imaging. I'm going to tell you about one of the jewels in our crown, the Roman inscriptions of Britain online, so how we do digital epigraphy, and a little bit about how we're coordinating data, non-epigraphic data, writing equipment to think about Latinization and literacy. And then I'm going to pass over to Peter Hutter, who's one of the research fellows on the project, and he's going to expand our view out to a pan-provincial level and talk to you about some of our big-ish data. I mean, it's big for classics, but it's not really big in the broader world of data. So he'll talk you through our data set, our epigraphic data set, which is largely derived from the Amazing Eagle project and uses Epidoc. He'll explain to you all about that. He'll show you some of the highlights of our social factors data set and give you some idea of the kind of visualizations and analyses that we can perform on our data using geographic information systems. And at the very end, I'm going to try and draw some, this will be very brief because we'll have run out of time by then, some general conclusions about what we're finding from our data sets. And that'll be about complexity, multiple identities, and regional specificities. So get us all in the mood, get us sort of in the right kind of time period and place. I am going to transport you first to Tabard Square in Southwark, London in the 2nd century CE. So you've got to imagine you're there, right? So you're walking into this image. What can you see and smell and hear most importantly around you? So I'm going to give you a little exploration into a soundscape from the 2nd century CE provincial capital. So you can see a Romano-Celtic temple, so-called, in front of you. And there's some crows cawing in the sky. And if you look out beyond the kind of marshland, you can see parts of the settlement of Londinium. And you can smell in the air the distinctive smell of burning offerings on the altar. What can you hear around you? So to the right of the altar, you spot a group of snappily dressed togaed men who you don't recognize, they're not from around here. And they're speaking to one another in a high level Latin, and they're switching into Greek mid-sentence, between sentences and so on. They're speaking an in-group language and they're kind of a bit proud of it. They're officials from beyond Britannia. To the left of the altar, you spot another group of guys This time you recognize some of these people. These are local big men, as it were. And they're not exactly completely comfortable about what's going on. They're hearing too much Latin in their view in this central area. This was a ritual place dedicated to Camillus before, and they would prefer if it was Celtic being spoken, British Celtic being spoken in this sacred space. You can hear some kids running around. They're switching between British Latin and British Celtic quite happily without even really realizing it. And you can also see a bunch of people that look like they're dressed for the road, a series of traders speaking various different languages, and you spot within them varieties from Palmyra in central Syria, whose first language is Palmyrene, second language is Greek, and third language is Latin. And he has by his side his new wife, Regina, from the tribe of the Catawalauni, and she's struggling to understand him because her first language is British Celtic. And just in the distance, you catch the sound of Nata Wimpy, Kermida, pretty girl, bring me some beer, in the Gaulish language. Right, so there's a soundscape from 2nd century CE London. That might sound a bit fanciful, but every single vignette I've kind of described there is based in evidence that we have from the ancient world. Actually, for Southwark in London, we do have some direct evidence from this very site, which continues the theme of sociolinguistic exploration. So here's a dedication on a lovely bit of stone, beautifully carved, and it's dedicated to the divinities of the Augusti and to the god Mars Camillus. Mars, Roman god, and Camillus, a Celtic name god. And it's dedicated by Tiberinus Cellerianus, who describes himself as being a citizen of the Bellovaci, which is the area in and around Beauvais in modern France. And what's really cool about this inscription is the end bit, Moritix Londiniensium. So he describes himself as a Moritix of the Londoners. Now, were I to ask David, he might know because he's probably seen this stone before, what Moritix is. But if I was to ask a classicist what Moritix is and they haven't seen this stone before, they might scratch their head, feel a bit embarrassed, sneakily try and look it up in a Latin dictionary, and what would they find? Answer, nothing, because Moritix is not attested in Latin. It's attested twice here and in an inscription from Cologne. It's not an integrated word in the Latin language. So what is it? Well, the answer is it's Celtic. The first part, mori, means sea, and the second part, tix, so related to the Latin word for sea, and the second part, tix, means walking, stepping. So this is a sea stepper or a sea walker, probably some kind of sea trader. The equivalent would be LatinNow, perhaps. So the question is, why on this beautiful stone has this dedicator chosen to call himself a Moritix, rather than picking a Latin word like nauta? So I think the answer probably is to do with the sociolinguistic context here. So if this guy is from the continent, the local language alongside Latin over there is Gaulish, which is a Celtic language. And the other side of the channel over in London, or becomes London, the local language alongside Latin is British Celtic. So these two Celtic languages are actually very closely related about this time, to the point that we're not really sure how many features distinguish them, in fact. And it seems that he's probably chosen this term as a trader because by using this, he's saying, well, you know, I'm Roman, I'm entering into a Roman epigraphic habit here, but I'm picking a word that suggests that I'm one of you as well. I'm part of an in-group. So that example, and the fact that I've mentioned Celtic languages several times already in this talk, should suggest that when we're talking about LatinNow, the project, we're not just interested in Latin, very much not so. We're interested in really understanding the other languages that are involved coming up in contact with Latin. And so that requires understanding the pre-Roman situation, so that we can see what's happening to those languages and communities under Rome. And we also want to look not just before Rome, but after Rome as well, to see what the sociolinguistic situation is in the post-Roman period, to find out what things that might suggest about how embedded or not Latin has been in certain parts of the Roman Empire. So here are two maps to show you the before and after. And in the LatinNow project, we're really lucky that we've got experts in Celtic languages and the Paleo-Hispanic languages and Germanic languages to rely on to understand some of these strange features. For example, in Latin inscriptions, but also in the epichoric epigraphy. So inscriptions written in non-Latin languages as well. So to clarify what LatinNow is all about, our research streams. So we're interested in Latinization. That means the nature of the spread of Latin. So why is it spreading? How is it spreading? How is education, for example, implicated or not? Where is it spreading? When is it spreading? Who's it spreading for? For how long is it spreading on, and how long does it last? And why is it not being taken up in certain communities? And we want to correlate what we can see about linguistic shift and maintenance with other social factors. And to be clear, when we say we're talking about Latin, Latin is not monolithic. So we're interested in the varieties of Latin that we can see over this long period and also quite a significant geographical space. Some of those varieties will be contact related, so a result of contact with one of the many non-Latin languages, or there will be social varieties, or there will be changes over time, or there'll be gender-based varieties or whatever it is. And we're interested in those, and we're also interested in the nature of bi and multilingualism, because it's very much not an either or thing, as you saw from my soundscape at the beginning. People are often speaking more than one language, and we're interested in what happens to these local languages. Why do some survive and others not? And also at the heart of our project, because of the nature of our evidence, is of course the issue of literacy. What we're not interested in is the kind of ongoing debate about percentages of literacy in various provinces. We're not interested in trying to create percentages for, say, Britannia versus Gaul versus the Iberian Peninsula or whatever it is, because those percentages are very hard to come by, but also because, as you'll see, as we will keep repeating, there's so much regional specificity and provincial specificity within provinces that it becomes kind of meaningless anyway. So what we're interested in is a kind of socio-literacy in the same way that we're interested in a socio-linguistics rather than just a linguistics. So how do we do this? This is really hard. We've got a big area and we've got a lot of material and we've got a long time to work with. And we're also working with lots of communities that are not that well known, frankly. So we're trying to write a social history, essentially, with a focus on language. And I think in order to do this, the best way that we possibly can is to do it in an interdisciplinary way. So what we try to do is take the evidence, but also some of the perspectives and approaches from sociolinguistics, epigraphy, which is the writing on things, and archaeology to try to write this social history. And there are two main big issues that I just want to flag up before we get further into the digital humanities bit, which you're all here for. And that is, one is the fundamental thing that is at the heart of everything we do, and it's not straightforward, and that is the complex nexus between language, identities, and cultures. We do not assume that these things are linked in a neat one-to-one way. Okay, so just because, for example, you see a Celtic name in a document, in a text, that does not mean anything like kind of Celtic ethnicity or whatnot. We realize that these things are very complicated. Languages always reflect identities, but which exactly and how and what parts of the language is very, very complicated. So we try to take nothing for granted and try to be aware of our potentially anachronistic gaze when we're looking at some of this material. And another thing that will be very close to the heart of all the digital humanities people on this Zoom meeting is the thing in the middle box there. We are at the mercy of our data in lots of ways. And we try to do two things. One is to be very acutely aware of the scales of analysis that we're operating on. We try to control these, and we try to think constantly about keeping all the different scales, whether that's pan-provincial, provincial, regional, or farmstead level. We try to keep them all in play so that we have the best possible context for our materials and for our analysis. But we also constantly have to learn and improve our ways of reading the gaps. So, these gaps are sometimes, we need to always try to remember to assess whether the gaps may be a result of, archaeological survival, archaeological practices, and/or publication practices. There's all kinds of biases that may be absolutely nothing to do with the ancient world. And we constantly have to revise our understanding of how we might go about sort of working with those gaps, and which ones we can cope with and which ones we can't so well. So briefly on Roman Britain, I'm going to zoom in, and here you get some of the digital that you've been waiting for. So our first case study is Roman Britain, and I'm just going to show you sort of 3 ways in which we're doing digital humanities things working on this part of the ancient world. So one of the things we've been working on is simply being able to have new text. So simply reading old objects. We're reading the text on them that have never been read before. So some of these hasn't been read for 2,000 years. And you can see in front of you some of the texts that we play with, which are extremely difficult to read. And one of the ways that digital techniques that we can use to help us read them is reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. So at the top there on the right, there's some poetry from Roman Kent that we've been able to read using this technique. Beneath it is a curse tablet. And on the bottom left there is one of the unpublished Stylus Tablets from Vindolanda. Those of you who know Vindolanda will know that there's a set of very important ink-written tablets from Vindolanda. What you may not know is that there's rather a lot of unpublished Stylus Tablets from Vindolanda. Here's a reconstruction of a Roman Stylus tablet from the Bloomberg site in the City of London. Many of you will know about this site, even if you're not a classicist, because it hit the news. Loads of Stylus tablets came out of the ground from Bloomberg European headquarters, right in the heart of the City of London, from around the conquest, so really nice and early 1st century AD example. And here's a reconstruction of one of them. So a wooden tablet with a recess into which the Romans would put soot blackened wax. David knows all about wax, and they would inscribe into them using a stylus or something else pointy. It doesn't have to be a stylus. And it looks a bit like that. When we find Stylus tablets, it doesn't look like this, unfortunately. The wax is almost always completely gone. And so what we have is just this kind of backplate of the wood. And we have to hope that the person writing on these things pressed just a little bit too hard. Those people who leave marks on the desks in schools through the wood, just a little bit too hard into the wax, and so it leaves the message by accident on the wood behind. Sometimes we're too lucky and too many people have pressed too hard, because these are reusable on the same tablet, so we get multiple texts, a palimpsest, which is very difficult to read, as you'll see in a minute. So you'll notice that the curse tablets, the Stylus tablet, and the pottery that I show, these are all things that are incised. And what reflectance transformation imaging is really good at is allowing us to read things that have some kind of texture to them, some kind of sort of lower and upper bits, as it were. So ink written things are less well served with this technology. You need texture, you need a bit of 3D-ness on the surface. And what you do is you ideally use a dome array where you have a camera at a fixed point and you have LED lights all around in a dome, and you change which one is turned on, and you keep taking a picture. So you take pictures from the same point of the object, but it's lit from say 100 different directions. And then you use some whizzy software, and it allows you to create, here's a Superdome at Oxford, it allows you to create a file that you can then manipulate. So the reflectance information, so that's the highlights and shadows, is derived from this kind of 3D-ness of the object, and it's encoded in each one of the pixels in the image. And so then you can manipulate, you can relight the object in your image to enhance the different shadows and highlights to read things better. So here's an example from the Cultural Heritage website, showing at the bottom a kind of normal rendering with just colour, and then in the upper part, specular enhancement. And you can see the difference in terms of the 3D-ness that becomes visible. So another thing that we can do with RTI is work on removing something like the wood grain, which is really helpful in the case of the Stylus tablet. So there's a lot of noise coming from the wood grain, which is very distracting as an epigrapher trying to read it. With the kind of digital environment, we can remove that wood grain, and that again helps us to read the text on these Stylus tablets. Another problem, like I said, was this palimpsest situation. So here's a nice example from Bloomberg, where you can see that there is more than one text on this sort of backplate of the Stylus tablet, as it were. And using the latest sort of technique coming out of Oxford, the OxRTI viewer, they've been able to do various things, including annotation, where you can annotate the different messages as you see them in different colors, and then remove them as appropriate. And again, that helps us to try and read things that are very difficult with a human mind when there's just too much going on. So we can read, we can produce new texts that sociolinguists and ancient historians can play with. The other thing we can do is try to read texts that have been read quite a long time ago by earlier scholars before RTI existed. So just briefly, and this isn't from Roman Britain, but here's the Frisian ox tablets, which some of you may have heard of. The Frisian ox tablet is famous because it was found outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire in Friesland in the Netherlands. Peter knows all about that, he's Dutch. So he could tell you more about this part of the world. But yeah, so this was found in Friesland, and one of the things that area is famous for is its Frisian cattle. And so this caused a big stir because this tablet is apparently the sale of a Frisian ox. Unfortunately, when the team from the Centre for the Study of Ancient Documents looked a bit closer, sadly, and this is not work that we've done in LatinNow, this is prior to LatinNow, the Frisian ox, so in Latin that's the bowem bit, disappeared altogether, and it just became part of quem, so it was ad quem rather than el bowem, which actually ended up making this a much more standard text after all. Sometimes our improvements are not always what we want them to be. They don't necessarily make things more exciting. So we have these texts that in some cases are new for us to research. What do we do with them? So we don't just read them and leave them in our piles of papers. We try to get them online as much as possible. And one of the great things of the recent boom in digital epigraphy has been Scott Vanderbilt's Roman Inscriptions of Britain online, which is a real standout example of this kind of work. Scott conceived of this and put the first version up in 2014. He joined us in 2017, and in 2019 we relaunched a revamped and expanded version of it. So the first version just had volume 1, the lapidary inscriptions. The current version has volume 3, which is the new lapidary inscriptions, and not new, but a new volume of Latin inscriptions. The Bloomberg Stylus tablets that we've mentioned, and the Vindelander ink written tablets, which I've also mentioned. Now, I hope, given who I saw who was coming in earlier, who's on this call, I hope that many of you will already have seen Scott's wonderful website. If you have used it, you will know that one of the great things about it is the amazing searching that you can do, you can do really quite detailed searching. And one of the reasons why that is possible is because behind the scenes, that you can't see this, all the records, all the texts are heavily encoded in Epidoc format. So Epidoc is TEI XML, especially designed for epigraphy. So we've got a huge amount of metadata encoded behind the scenes, and that obviously allows the website to work really well and to allow great searching, but it also allows us in the LatinNow project to be able to do some really interesting detailed research. And the thing is that if we all use the same categories and we use the same vocabularies for the same things, then, and that's what we're trying to do within the LatinNow project, we can do advanced searching and detailed analysis over really very large sets of material, which Peter's going to show you in a minute. And we're working with the epigraphic community to sort of refine some of these and make sure everyone's happy with what we're doing. And this is because we really want to do linked open data in the best possible way. And before I move on to Peter, he's also going to talk about non-epigraphic things. I'm also just going to mention non-epigraphic things. So far, we've been mainly talking about written things. There's one other big set of material that we might want to include specifically when thinking about language and literacy, and that's a non-epigraphic type of material, and that's writing equipment. So this is thoroughly archaeological material. And often epigraphers don't really pay too much attention to the writing equipment per se, but it is actually really quite important for thinking about socio-literacy and Latinization. So somewhere like Britain, when you find writing equipment, the chances are it was used for writing, you know, or at least aspirations to write. There are some funny examples of writing equipment being used to kill people and, well, it's not really funny, kill people and to poke elephants with, and so on in the literary sources. But the vast majority of writing equipment, most of the time, is going to be to write. So it can be used as a proxy for literacy. It can also, in provinces such as Rome and Britain, but some of our other provinces as well, also be used as a proxy for Latinization, because 99 point something times out of 100, when you're writing in Rome and Britain, you're writing Latin. There are about just under half a dozen, let's say, British Celtic texts from Rome and Britain, a couple of new ones coming out soon, I hope. But largely the language, the written language of the country is Latin. So therefore, when you're finding writing equipment, that can also be used as a proxy for Latinization. What's great about the province Britannia is that there are some national level data sets that have included writing equipment in their analyses, in their categorizations of things, you know, what they're interested in essentially. So the Portable Antiquities scheme has writing equipment as a category, and the rural settlement in Rome and Britain also has collected the evidence for writing equipment. So Portable Antiquities scheme is largely metal detected finds and so on. The rural settlement project is collecting evidence from excavations in rural contexts. And what's really great about combining this kind of evidence with our epigraphic evidence is that it shows us different sides of things. So if you plot, so here's a plot of some of the writing equipment. If you put a map of the lapidary distribution, so the stone inscriptions next to this, it's completely different. And there are reasons for that, and that's because the lapidary inscription is largely the result of the military and of foreigners and so on. So the two things don't necessarily overlap in easy ways. So we're really interested in getting this writing equipment together and analysing the context in which it's being found and what that's telling us about rural and other types of literacy. And in order to one of the problems about working on writing equipment is that The other provinces don't have this kind of data set available just yet. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to coordinate what work has been done and trying to encourage people to do more systematic analysis on bigger scales. And Anna Villi has just finished one volume of our Manual of Roman Everyday Writing, which will be completely open access, available for free online in about 2 months' time, which covers all the different types of writing equipment to try and encourage people to identify and use them in their interpretations. So that's a quick insight into what kind of things we can do for Roman Britain. And now Peter's going to take us across the whole of the provinces, looking at our digital resources. So over to you, Peter.
Yeah, everything has gone well. I've taken control of the screen now. And you should be able to see my mouse moving on the screen. So yeah, so I was just talking about finishing off on the non-epigraphic data, which is one of the data sources we're using. Of course, the most important one for us is the epigraphic data, which we obtained through the Europeana Eagle project. And these are all epidoct files. And these two we bring together. So the epigraphic data and the non-epigraphic data we bring together in our databases. The epigraphic data goes into our 4D or 4-dimension relational database. And we can work in there, and I'll show you in a bit how that looks, what that looks like. And then we add the epigraphic data to our GIS project, combine it with the non-epigraphic data, and start looking at spatial patterns, and we can do some analyses, and I will show some very simple overviews during this presentation. To get an idea of the epigraphic data set and how we got to it, we have this beautiful diagram made by one of our colleagues, Simona. So here we have LatinNow in the center of the diagram, and on the left side, all our epigraphic sources. Here at the bottom, the linguistic features that have come into our database, and the places from Pleiades and Trismegistos. I'll focus a bit more on the epigraphy side. So I already mentioned Eagle as the main contributor for the Latin epigraphy. It's a massive project that collected all the inscriptions of the Roman Empire, all the Latin inscriptions of the Roman Empire, through a multitude of databases. The ones mentioned here are the ones relevant for our research areas. We have quite limited research. I will show you, you've seen the map already. It's only the Roman West. And therefore, it's only a few databases that have gone in. But you can imagine when you have these databases and they slightly overlap, there will be duplicates. So Eagle has done a great job trying to identify identifying duplicates and getting them out. And that's the data we obtained in 2017. In addition, as already mentioned, on the side, one of our projects, which is a massive one, a very good one, is the Roman Inscriptions of Britain, but that automatically feeds into our database as well. And then, because we are also interested in the Paleo-European languages, or the languages before Latin, we have the Hesperia database, and we work closely with the people from ELO. In the end, we will have a open WebGIS where people can play, adding the social factors. So for instance, the roads and the cities. We'll have our books and publications, all in open access. Alex just announced Anna's open source ebook that will be out soon. And we did some, we're doing at the moment, knowledge exchange, and we did some outreach events. And in the end, because everything will be open access, we hope slightly lost that era, but we hope that everything will feed back to the projects from which we have drawn our data and enhance their data as well. So for those not in epigraphy and in classics, a short overview of what we're actually collecting and what we're talking about. So here we have the inscription we looked at earlier, the Moritix inscription. And on the one side, we have all the data we want to collect about the inscription. So where is it, and what type of material is it, to what period is it dated? and on the right-hand side, the text, of which we're, of course, also interested. And I've highlighted, or colored, the text. The orange bits you can see are the bits we can actually read on the stone, and all the yellow bits, those are the bits that have been added by epigraphers, because we know that num aug is numinibus Augustorum. It's an abbreviation, we know about that. So if we read it, we complement that abbreviation so it's easier to read. But at the bottom of the inscription, you can see it's broken. And sometimes we can reconstruct pieces that are broken, and these go into square brackets on parentheses to indicate this is a broken piece, a broken bit, and I've not I, but an epigrapher has reconstructed this PR. And this is where, for instance, matching duplicates becomes really hard. Because if we have the same text, but we have multiple variants of the same text, in different databases, it becomes hard to identify the text as being the same. If we had always the same reading, it would be a lot simpler. Now, to add to this, we also have a problem that sometimes the bibliography is incomplete. So sometimes we might have one edition with only the bibliography using that one edition. And in another database, another project, they might have been using another reading and they only refer to the bibliography belonging to that one reading, which makes it even harder to identify these two sources as being the same. So the first one, where we have two different texts, slightly different because they're different readings, but the bibliography is the same, we have been able, actually our technical director has been able to write a piece of code that matched all, we have 181,000 texts, that has checked all texts against each other, and with a higher than 95% similarity, these texts were flagged up and the bibliography was checked. If the bibliography was the same, the texts are the same and they have been combined. In the case that the texts are 95% similar and the bibliography is different, in that case, we have been looking at them separately, individually. So we've been actually checking all the bibliography to identify these texts that are similar. Now you might wonder, how is it possible that we actually, that our technical director can write a piece of code and read all these texts? And that has everything to do with Epidoc, we've just been talking about. And Epidoc started when one of the epigraphers, we might say an early adapter, realized that you can actually encode this to make it easier on a computer to read, for a computer to read and to render this in websites. So if you have, we call this the line conventions, as epigraphers have agreed to write the editions, the different readings of a text, you can write that in code, a markup language, which we use in Epidoc, and that way you make sure that a computer can read it simply. And of course, you can go a step further and actually encode everything. So the two sites I just showed you with all the information, you can encode all of that. So you can encode the museum it is and the inventory number, the description of the object, you can encode the whole text. You can actually also tag elements within the text. So the Moritics, you can tag that as a Celtic word in a Latin inscription. And that makes these inscriptions machine readable, and that is the power of our database. And this is our 4D database, working with the Epidoc files, searching them. So we have different tables, as already said, we have inscriptions and places. So the epigraphy and the places have gone in there. And when we check, for instance, the inscriptions, here we have our, so the starting of the database, the first page, as I said, 181,000 inscriptions, the ID code, the Epidoc files, the province, the Roman province, places. Here we see one of these inscriptions that already has been identified as a duplicate by Eagle. So we have EDCS, the Klaus Schlaby database, and HD, the Heidelberg database. So Eagle gave that to us in 2017 with already identified, not one, a multitude of duplicates. And then we have the material and the text type. Now this looks really, really bad. It's only the first few dozen, and by bad luck, they're all unknown text type. Now, this has to do, on the one hand, with the interest of researchers. So sometimes researchers might feel that it's not important to record this data and they leave it out, or it might seem too obvious to actually note down what text type it is. This might look quite bad, but in reality, we have a lot more than only unknown. But also with the machine reading, we can start identifying text by using these standard formulae. So for instance, these manibus is the start of funerary epigraphy. So we know that when an inscription starts with these manibus, it's funerary. So we can identify all these inscriptions as funerary by only searching for this formulaic start. And there is a multitude of these things we can use. And by that, we can identify the texts by the thousands using this machine readable Epidoc file. Now, I've here already entered a inscription number, so it's one of the ID codes, and I can query that, and then we see a specific inscription here from Hispania, not by chance that I've chosen that, that's my research area. If we click that, we go into the database and we can see what we have. So on this side is what we see when we start in the table, and this is in the back, let's call it like that. So the language is Latin, the stone is limestone, and unfortunately the text type is not assigned. And this looked really bad, but I actually searched for one that was not assigned. And then we have the geographical associations. What we have down here is the related identifier, and that leads us to HEP, Hispania Epigraphica, the Spanish database. And we have a linked database. It's not a linked open database, but it's a linked database. So if we click go, we go to the website. And then to my surprise, and luckily for this presentation, I saw that the text type is known. And our database doesn't have the text type. And this means that this text type has been identified after we got, in 2017, the data from Eagle. And this is, I think, the strongest argument for linked open data. So somebody else has, in Spain, has added this information that was not there earlier. And now I have to add that information as well. Were we all working linked open data, this could have been done easily over vast distances at the same time. So text time not assigned, I can click that. We click funerary epitaph because that's what we've seen. Click save, and there it is, funerary epitaph. So we've done that. Now, our technical director is a very smart person, so has decided that we have an original data tab where we can see how we got the data. And here we can see one of the things Alex mentioned before, and that's the vocabulary that we are using. Because we're using data from different parts of Europe where we all speak different languages, we have Hispania Epigraphica in Spanish, and we have German, and we have French. And I fear, I'm not sure, I fear we might even have some Dutch in there as well. But we have been discussing how to translate all these, decided on that, but then keep this in there so we can always go back to the original data. Now, there is one more feature I want to show you before we go to the QGIS, and that is how do I get all this data into my QGIS? And that is this great small button here. It's the export button. And that allows us to export the data in, for instance, a CSV or a GeoJSON file, which is then easily transformed and added to a QGIS interface. So this is one of the first maps I actually made within this within the LatinNow project for a very specific reason. And it shows all the places that hold epigraphy, and then we have decided to highlight the places that have more than 500 inscriptions. And then you see the yellow diamonds here that say tour objects, which is really weird in a map of epigraphy, but actually it's incredible at this time in our lives. But in the autumn of 2019, we did a European tour. We traveled 6 countries in Europe in a month's time. We met thousands of people We were very close to each other, not wearing masks and none of that. And we were actually going out to schools, universities, museums to talk about our project, to present our project, our ideas, and get this outreach to give people the idea, what are we actually doing? And for us, it's also really nice to realize that what we are doing behind our desks, behind our computers, is actually interesting for more than only the odd scientists in the same corner. And the 6 languages, so this is in Germany, in a museum in Trier. Before the museum was open, it was a lot busier than that. So that was in German. Here we have French, and this is in Barcelona, where we had everything, so the whole display and all the cards in Catalan. But back to this map. So this is a simple view, just showing the places with epigraphy, and we're highlighting specific places that have high concentrations. What I was wondering then is, how dense is this density? And for that, I made a heat map. And heat maps are very interesting. So what we can do is actually see where densities are real densities without looking at specific places. The downside is that places with high densities also show up. So some of these nice dots, for instance, this one, that is Tarraco, the place I showed earlier with the 2000 inscriptions. That's radiating out because I'm using a heat map and I'm working with a radius. The same here, I will show you in a bit. We have again a place that is, so that's Trier, which was once the capital of the western part of the Roman Empire, and it's radiating out. But we can also see features, for instance, down here, where we see concentrations, and the people knowing the Iberian Peninsula will probably immediately realize what that concentration is going to be. But also here we see some concentrations we might, so just mention Trier, we might want to look at. And this is where we bring in, for instance, the non-epigraphic data, so social factors. So we've brought in the roads and cities, forts and limes regions, and then we can see that here, but we already saw that because the wall was there. We can see the wall here. Well, the density down there, we see a density of cities as well. So we might start thinking about a correlation there. We see the same here in the south of France, but I think this is really interesting, something really interesting going on. When I go back, you see these 3 nice dots there. We see that indeed this one is created by a single city by chance. But here we see a colony, Cologne, aptly named, and 2 legionary camps. And the 3 items together are showing a high density, which was not as clear when we were looking at the earlier maps, and there's more concentrations. And of course, when we zoom in, we start playing with these heat maps, we can show different elements. Something else we have to keep in mind when thinking about factors that might impede or create concentrations is geography. So I saw this neat concentration of settlements. I saw that, of course, before the heat map as well, and you can see the upper Rhine valley creating this nice chamber where you can settle, and that might, in this case, it doesn't show up, but it might actually lead also to epigraphic concentrations. And then lastly, we can, of course, zoom in on specific regions, as I actually already did with the upper Rhine valley. We can zoom in on areas, and then we can zoom in on specific time periods. So this is the pre-first century non-epicoric epigraphy of the Iberian Peninsula. So these are the languages that are not from the Iberian Peninsula. So the Paleo-Hispanic languages are not displayed here, but we see Phoenician, Greek, and Latin epigraphy before the imperial period. So it's a question I asked to the database is, show me this epigraphy, and then I can see patterns and start asking other questions of why do we see the patterns we're seeing here.
So yeah, thank you very much, Peter. So I promised some very brief sort of overall conclusions for the kind of patterns we're seeing, the conclusions that we're going to be presenting in 2023. And these kind of are constantly converging around a couple of things. One is complexity. So we know that the ancient world is full of various entanglements. We know that this is partly why there's lots of multiple identities, and these create discrepant experiences. And we can see this from a kind of sociolinguistic perspective. So we're exploring this complexity. And the other thing that is coming out repeatedly is the regional specificities within a bigger picture that is more constant. So when I conceived of the project now quite a long time ago in 2016, I set forward, I kind of made a series of predictions about what kind of social factors were going to be important in Latinization. And there were kind of, several factors that I thought were going to be key. And it turns out, kind of, I suppose, disappointing in a way, that we haven't really added to those, and we haven't said that any of those were not realistic. So these are things like the military or urbanism, connectivity, etc. So these are all things that I think any ancient historian is going to guess are going to be likely important in the spread of Latin. But what we are finding is that we can say a lot more about these factors using this kind of big picture analysis and being able to harness the power of digital humanities to help us. And we're really being able to add some flesh onto the bones of some of these social factors and draw out the regional specificity. So we've already seen quite a few things already. We can see different provinces are showing different profiles, but within them there are regional complexities. So if we zoom in on a couple of the social factors just briefly, one that's been mentioned just recently by Peter is the urbanism Latinization correlation. So we found that urbanization and Latinization do go hand in hand, but that is not to the same extent in every province, and in every area of every province there are real differences. And there's also real and sometimes surprising differences in terms of the impact that urban centres are having on their hinterlands. So some really major epigraphic centres don't seem to be sort of radiating out a Latinization force from their urban centres, but others really very much do. So it's kind of a case of this regional specificity being a part of this awareness that we were talking about, the importance of looking at the local communities. What are the local community profiles looking like? And that has a big impact on how Latinization is panning out. One of the things that we think has a lot of potential that Peter is currently working on is in looking at areas where we do have a lot of data and information about settlement types, building up profiles of the epigraphic content of various types of settlements might be quite valuable for looking at areas where we have epigraphy from other settlements. We don't really know what status they had. So being able to do this kind of big picture analysis, and I know I've just said that there are regional variety, but within the settlements themselves, there do seem to be recurring epigraphic outputs, and so we can start to do some interesting work and sort of trying to predict what kind of settlements might have produced which of the epigraphic outputs. So that's a kind of important part of our work, is looking at the urbanization side of things. Another important social factor that we've been exploring is the military. So, you ask someone, how does Latin spread in the ancient world? Before too long, someone is going to say the military. Now, it is not the case that the Roman military is going around beating people into speaking Latin. There are a couple of examples of that actually happening. It is true in the literary sources, but on the whole, we don't think that they were sent out to spread Latin. But they do have an impact in the spread of Latin. But it's complicated. And again, we see regional specificity. So it is the case that, of course, the Roman army environment is where, in lots of cases, auxiliaries will be coming into contact with Latin, and in particular literacy, perhaps for the first time. So there's no doubt that the military is a Latinizing force, particularly for its own staff. Sorry, my chair's making noise. However, it is not the case that we can see a direct correlation with military settlements and the radiating out of Latin. Again, it depends on the nature of the military settlement, it depends on the nature of the communities around them, and it depends on the nature of the relationship between the two, which clearly in some cases was not calm and friendly. So it is not the case that we can see the military as spreading Latin across the provinces beyond the fort walls in every case. What does seem to happen in quite a few cases, however, is that we can trace the Latinization of homelands. So whilst you know, the hinterland may or may not be affected, the homeland from where the people are recruited often is. So there seems to be some evidence, for example, looking at the northern part of the continent, that the area that the Tungrians and Batavians that were stationed, for example, at Hadrian's Wall, were coming from, so a very dense area of recruitment, seems to show higher levels of epigraphic habit and literacy than other non-recruiting areas. So the picture is very much localized and specific in its details, and that's what our project is showing in detail. And I hope that this time that we've just spent presenting one aspect of the project, so the digital humanities side of things specifically, has given you a flavour of the kind of work we're doing, and we'd be very happy to take questions. Thank you.